Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my Worlds 2022 Group Stage Day 2 overview and analysis of all 6 games that we got here today. Obviously, at the beginning of this tournament, we have one group getting a day off, essentially per day for the first 4 days. So today, no Group D, but we do have Group A, Group B, and Group C action on the docket. Very exciting because Group C actually gets to play for the first time at the tournament here. So a lot of teams getting their first look. And it was really interesting. A lot of really fun and exciting games here today. Not a lot of boring ones. And so let me know what you guys' favorite game was down in the comment section below. Obviously, a lot of good ones to choose from. Let me know who's overperforming, who's underperforming your expectations. We're only 2 days into the event, but of course, that means we're a third of the way essentially into Group Stage 4. A couple of these groups. And so definitely some things to start talking about at this point, especially with Groups A and B. But let me know all of that down in the comments section below. But of course, with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into our analysis. As you know, on this channel, we go game by game, talking about who did well, why they did well, whether I liked the draft, whether I didn't like the draft, who played well, etc, etc. It's a full review. You know how it goes here. You've been around the block. So let's go ahead and kick it off with game number 1. And we actually kicked game number 1 off with a Group C matchup that we had not seen yet up until this tournament. And so we get the number 1 seed from the LEC in Europe. We get Rogue taking on the number 4 seed from the LCK in Korea in DRX. Obviously, DRX coming through the play-in tournament. They went undefeated in their group stage, including a very big win over Royal Never Give Up to get here. And honestly, they looked great throughout that entire play-in stage. They looked pretty much unbeatable. Most especially Zika in the mid lane was phenomenal. Whether it was on the Akali, whether it was on the LeBlanc, whether it was on even something like the Victor. He was just really consistent. He was the best player on this team throughout most of the year, as I've been saying in my LCK weekly recaps. And he continued that trend very much in play-ins. I think he got overshadowed a tad bit in the LCK, but it certainly is not going to happen on the main stage. So what ended up happening in this game? Well, DRX's undefeated streak at Worlds is over, as Rogue is actually able to take a huge game number 1 win here in their group. Now, this is one of the most important matchups that both of these teams are going to have in the group. Obviously, Top Esports being up there as well, but Rogue and DRX are very likely fighting for that 2nd seed to get out of this group, you know, assuming things go to chalk. And so for Rogue to be able to pick up this win to start the tournament off is really huge on their part. And honestly, I really like the way that they did it. Talked about this on the channel quite a bit before Worlds started, but Rogue, of all teams, I expected to kind of stick to the meta that got them to the dance in the first place. They really haven't switched up their style all that much all year long. They've been very good at drafting the things they know they're good at, and at putting themselves in positions where they can feel comfortable. I have at multiple points throughout the season called Rogue the best drafting team in the world, and I kind of hold that up. They really have a good idea of how they want to play the game, and I think they execute on it rather well, and I think this draft kind of exemplifies that. Obviously, some bad things from DRX. When you are on red side, you simply cannot leave Maokai up. Huge mistake from DRX, and Rogue is actively able to capitalize on it. They draft the Maokai, they move it up into the top lane. We talked about this on the channel. Top, jungle, even support to an extent, all viable lanes for Maokai right now. I think top's actually way stronger than people are giving it credit for, and that's kind of what we saw in this game. What top lane actually allows you to do with Maokai is scale up even further than typical. Like, you can become actually unkillable, which we saw this game, and Odoamne dominated on that pick. I'm not going to cut corners here. I'm just going to get straight to the point. Odoamne's player of the game here on the Maokai. An unbelievable performance from him. Obviously, he wasn't going to be able to carry the game in terms of damage, although I think he did the 2nd most damage in the game, which is absurd. He did more damage than the Azir, but whatever. It is what it is. You have the Trundle to kind of facilitate with that front line, and then you have Comp playing really out of his mind on the Lucian as well. I really like this comp. Obviously, a lot of people are kind of tearing into teams still going Lucian Nami at Worlds. Of course, the interaction between Lucian Nami and like the Electrocute procs and things like that, disabled, taken out of the game, not there anymore. And so a lot of people thought this lane was going to be dead, but I think those people underestimate how stubborn and how practiced a lot of teams are at the World Championship. I'm not really going to complain about it, especially if you're going to play like this. And honestly, pretty much everybody who's brought out this pick has looked at least pretty good on the Lucian so far. And that's because Lucian didn't get nerfed. Nami's numbers didn't get nerfed. The only thing that got nerfed was the interaction. These two still are very viable as a duo, mostly because it's not like Nami still doesn't give Lucian everything he wants. Gives him sustainability in the laning phase so that his lack of range doesn't really matter. Gives him the movement speed and has a decent amount of CC, plus Nami ult plus Maokai ult in like team fights, especially if you're controlling the area. That is incredibly difficult to actively deal with. especially on the other side when you're a Misfortune whose ultimate channel can just be interrupted. You add on to that a Trundle Pillar, which, I mean, just absolutely obliterated the MF throughout a large majority of this game, and Rogue was really off to the races, so big credit to Ottawamne. He played the top lane tank role basically perfectly, played weak side early game, and got ganked a couple times, never died to him, played really, really safe, played really smart, and then got into that late game where he was basically 1v4ing everybody on DRX towards the back half. This Maokai could not die. I think the Sunfire Aegis did like 3k damage by itself, and then he did like 25k damage in this game. It's actually absurd. That champion is so ludicrously busted right now. I put a tweet out on Twitter. Shameless plug if you don't follow me on Twitter. Link is down in the description. But I put a tweet out that was essentially like, we've been complaining about Zeri Sivir all year long. And yes, they're really, really annoying. But at least they had each other. Like, at least they were able to, like, you could draft Zeri and you would be able to answer with Sivir, right? Like, you at least had an answer. There is no answer to Maokai right now. Like, there just isn't. He's the best thing in the game, and it's not all that close. I know a lot of people value Aatrox really highly. I think Maokai's a tier above him. I think Aatrox is really strong, but Maokai is just the best pick in the game right now, and I think it shows basically every time he's put on a good team here that he is really able to dominate. I mean, 25k damage from a full tank Maokai is actually just ludicrous, and with all the utility and the vision and the survivability and the ultimate, like, the movement speed that he gets from it, it's actually absurd what he's able to do right now. But Ottawamne piloted him really well. Obviously, Otto not a stranger to weak side tanks top, but Maokai really, really doing a lot in that late game to be able to kind of complete the whole team there. And then Comp and Trimby really headlining the damage dealing here. Comp especially was really going off, especially in the mid game here. Did make a little bit of a mistake in the mid game around the mid lane, and that's fine. You know, sometimes you can get a little bit over aggressive, especially on the Lucian, but for the most part, he was phenomenal, especially for someone going to their first World Championships. I was actually a little bit concerned about Comp going into Worlds, mostly because he had such a phenomenal breakout year after kind of being off of the radar of a lot of LEC teams. I was really concerned with whether or not that was going to be more of a flash in the pan, or whether he was going to dominate, other, more specifically Eastern bot lanes in the same way that he was able to dominate European bot lanes, but he was really, really solid in this game. Obviously, Lucian Nami is huge comfort for this Rogue team. It was comfort for Hansama and Trimby last year at Worlds. It's comfort again for Comp and Trimby throughout the entire year, so really not surprised to see this team in particular going to it, but they definitely performed. Malrang was awesome. Like I said, controlled the whole map early on in the game, was really shadowing that bot lane, making sure that Comp and Trimby could afford to play incredibly aggressive, and I think it definitely helped out Rogue in the long run, getting that Lucian ahead. And then Larson, good game on him too. Certainly some really, really good plays. Was taken advantage of a bit in the mid game here. Was kind of the low mobility target that DRX ended up having to go in on for the most part, but I think you can make a real case that he was better than Zika this game, and Zika's probably been the best mid laner in the tournament so far, if you count play and performances, and so very, very impressive on the side of Rogue just in general, and I think they played this game about as well as they could have, but draft was very, very good and they executed on it. As for DRX, a couple of good things, a couple of bad things. I don't hate the idea of the draft in essence, but Lee Sin Akali, we talked about this yesterday in day one, incredibly aggressive. You need to be able to generate a lot of those leads early, especially going into something like Trundle Azir, because that is simply not going to be good if you are even. Like, Lee Sin Akali not going to be able to hold up if you're not far ahead. You add on to that the Misfortune Amumu, going into the Lucian Nami, not the best matchup of all time for the Misfortune and the Amumu. Honestly, Nami can keep Lucian relatively healthy, and he can just try to poke out the MF, and there's really not a lot that, MF can actually do about that, unless the Amumu is ridiculously aggressive and you get a lot of jungle attention, which is probably what should have happened this game. Unfortunately, Juhan was actually set a little bit behind in the early game, and that basically spelled disaster for DRX throughout the rest of this game. The Akali was really never able to get online. Deft was really never able to get in positions. I talked about how there were so many ways for his ult to just get interrupted mid-cast, most notably the Trundle Pillars, which were just devastating towards the back half of that game. Deft could not do any damage. Beryl would go in, get his ult off, and die. This is the problem with Amumu. I do like the pick, I think, a lot more than most right now. I think he's probably the best engaged support in the meta, or at least the most consistent one, I guess, but he still is the Feast or Famine playstyle that he's been all year long that I've talked about on this channel. If Amumu goes in and you don't really have a lot of follow-up, like, this can go absolutely disastrous, and there were multiple moments throughout this game where DRX looked completely disjointed, like scarily disjointed, and we saw this for them in the regular season as well. This was a team that I made fun of on this channel for a considerable amount of time because they were so consistent at the pattern of going 2-0 and then 0-2 and then 2-0 and then 0-2 and just never having a week where they could win both of their series. Unfortunately for them, it looks looks like they got their 2-0 or 5-0 week in play-ins, and it really felt like the 0-2 DRX coming back out here. Barrel would, go in with no backup, or that play towards bottom inhibitor where Deft used his ult to clear the wave, and then Barrel goes in with the ultimate, and you no longer have a Misfortune ultimate, you have 0 damage to follow up. Like, it just feels like this team is not on the same page, and that's very distressing. But all that to say that my dud of the game is actually going to go to Kingen in the top lane, who just got run over by Odo Omne. It was a very boring top lane in the early game, but Kingen did get a little bit of attention, especially from that Lee Sin in the late early game, I would say, and Odo did a very good job of playing weak side. Kingen got so far behind, and on the Sejuani, you really are just like a worse version of Maokai in lane, especially, and so you get to these late game team fights, Kingen's getting absolutely blown up. Meanwhile, Odo is actually unkillable on the other side. It's definitely got to be frustrating on the side of DRX, but that's what you get when you trade off the Maokai for the Sejuani. I just don't think it's all that fair of a trade. So unfortunately, Kingen's going to get my dud of the game because he really didn't offer basically anything to this, but I think you could realistically give it to Juhan for not performing at all in the early game on a pick like Lee Sin, especially with something like Akali in the mid lane, not doing enough to enable the team to get ahead, but it is what it is for DRX. What can they do differently? Well, I don't think this early game aggressive playstyle really fits, especially when the opponents are going to get harder. Like, against top esports, I don't think you can afford to go this. I really don't hate the Akali. Again, Zika's shown that he can dominate a lot of these late game team fights on it, especially if he's able to generate at least a little bit of a lead, but things like the Lee Sin, things like the Sejuani, I just don't think are all that viable for DRX. I would expect them to go more to those tank junglers that they succeeded on a ton in play-ins, and then maybe something a little bit more like counter pick oriented in the top lane, and then just don't leave Maokai up. Like, that's another problem as well. Maokai's really strong. You give Maokai to a good team, they're going to be able to use him well, and so that's unfortunately what happened to DRX here. But for Rogue, you got to feel really good. They go back to comfort. They really understand their win cons. Maokai's left up. They're going to be happy about that, but I do like that they feel comfortable enough to go back to the Lucianami, not feel like they have to pivot off of it just because a lot of people are saying it's weak now. Just stay on comfort, and I promise this tournament is going to go a lot better than maybe a lot of other people think it's going to go for you. They're, with this win, they actually have a pretty good shot as long as they keep up the pace of being able to get out of groups here. Moving on to game number 2 here on day number 2, and it's a Group B matchup. A lot of, 2 imagery in this game. Not necessarily equitous to how these teams are performing, but just kind of an interesting little tidbit. One of the teams has a 2 in their name, so kind of a weird thing that all of this lines up. I'm just kind of noticing this as I record, but aside from that, it was a really interesting game. Obviously, NA versus E was always interesting, as we had the number 3 seed from the LCS in North America, and Evil Geniuses taking on the number 2 seed from the LEC in Europe in G2 Esports. And shocking basically no one, G2 is able to take this game. They were favorites going in. I think a lot of people had hoped that Evil Geniuses showing yesterday against JDG was a sign of good things, and potentially G2 showing against DAMWON was potentially a sign of bad things, but maybe it was just a little bit of jitters on G2's part, because they come back out here in game number 2, and they are dominant. This game was not close at all. I don't like the draft at all from Evil Geniuses. I've said that basically every single time a North American team has stepped onto the Rift at Worlds so far, with the exception of EG in plans, but just another kind of draft for me, right? Like, obviously, love the Maokai early. Never gonna complain about the Varus Tahm Kench, most specifically because Kaori and Vulcan have played it so well at this tournament. I would say overall that those three, fine. Impact had a really bad game on the Maokai. We'll talk about that, but it is what it is. You have the set in the mid lane. That can work really well with the super high damage jungler, something that you can really facilitate with. Set can set up very, very heavily, and we've seen JoJo do wonders on that champion, not only on play-ins, but obviously in Champions Queue as well. I think the Sylas matchup is fine. It allows Sylas to get a free engage, which isn't ideal, but you're going to be fine in laning phase, and honestly, JoJo did really good in the laning phase to be able to poke out Caps, kind of create an advantage until the map fell apart around him. Where I really struggle here is the Nidalee last pick. Obviously, Nidalee, not something we're seeing a ton of in the meta right now, mostly because early game junglers just need to be hyper efficient, and Nidalee is just not that. She's not Lee Sin in the sense that she doesn't really have this utility towards the back half of the game, especially if you're not going like the full just heal build, like literally Imperial Mandate or Moonstone or whatever you want to build like on Nidalee, like just make that heal buff. If you're going for damage, which Inspire did in this game by going Night Harvester, you simply have to get an early lead in this game, and no one told Inspired that. Like, it is actually unbelievably played so passive. I hate this term, but honestly, like, he absolutely pulled his best Evelynn cosplay in this game, because was he even in the game? Like, what happened? We'll talk about EG in a bit, but for G2, I mean, this was perfect. You talk about getting slaughtered yesterday, coming back here in game number 2, and rebounding really, really well. I think this was it. Obviously, a lot of really good things coming out of draft. I really like the Sylas early for Caps. Sylas and Caps, just a really good duo. It doesn't really matter what he's into. Even if you do have that counter pick set coming out in the mid lane, which I do think is relatively good for laning phase, Caps on Sylas is still going to be super useful in the late game, and you're telling me that having that Set ultimate isn't great, having that Varus ultimate isn't great, having the Maokai ultimate isn't great. There are a lot of fantastic uses for the Sylas in this game, not to mention the fact that he can just drain tank through the very low damage side of Evil Geniuses, especially if that Varus isn't online. Then you complement that Sylas with a lot of other things that kind of accomplish different goals, but can kind of do whatever needs to be done in the game, right? You have the Fiora in the top side who is going to be, pushing that lane, trying to pressure early, trying to generate that lead, and if she can get that, she can be a nuisance either in side lanes or just generally on the back half of team fights. Then you have the Aphelios, that is always going to scale up into the late game. You don't really have to worry about any sort of early aggression. You have the Sejuani, that's going to be a nice tank, but can disrupt a lot of things early. With good pathing, Yankos can actually be a huge nuisance, and then the Rel just kind of complements it all, gives you a free engage target, basically, something you can go in on and not really have to worry too much about hitting Sejuani ultimate or, getting a Maokai ult off of cooldown from Sylas. Like, it just gives you that go button that I think teams always like to have, and I do like this comp overall. I do think it could be a little bit susceptible to some early problems, and that's maybe why I understand the Nidalee pick at least a little bit, but even then, like, if you play well in the early game, we've seen Sejuani's be able to kind of neutralize a lot of those flaws in the early game, so long as they're, like, actively trying. And I think Yankos did a really good job here. It was significantly more impactful than whatever Inspired was doing this game, but truly, my player of the game is actually going to go to Targamas on this rail. Like I said, having that go button is pretty huge for a comp that really does rely on being able to fight towards this mid game, and honestly, Targamas was phenomenal in this game. To go and just be everywhere on the map, I mean, he was there for every single fight, every single engage, and to not ever really be in that much danger to die is super impressive. Like, I can't say enough how good of a game Targamas had. He's going to get player of the game down there on the rail. Flack had followed up really well on the Aphelios. Certainly some good moments and some bad moments. He actually had some good moments on the Caitlyn yesterday, but that pick was just always going to fall off. He was pretty okay in this one on the Aphelios. Certainly wasn't the focal point. I would say that Targamas going in really set up Broken Blade to do a ton of damage, and then obviously Caps and Yankos followed up. Aphelios was there, but he really wasn't, like, there. There was a lot of good stuff coming out from G2. Unfortunately, it wasn't Flackett, I should say. Mostly it was Targamas setting up Caps and setting up Broken Blade and really being able to expedite, I would say, the game from there. Really good execution on a really good game plan from G2. Really not a lot of complaints. They played out this game exactly how they needed to. As for Evil Geniuses, you gotta be frustrated. I mean, again, like, Inspired, I don't want to, like, be that guy, but, because I do, like, shit talk, right? Like, I'll just say it on this channel. I like when players go out and BM and say all this stuff in interviews and type in chat and blah, blah, blah. That's what big reason why I love JoJo so much and why I think so many people do love JoJo so much is because he goes and talks shit, but he does back it up on the Rift. If you're gonna go and do that in interviews and say, like, yeah, G2's not nearly as strong as we think, you simply cannot do this. You can't show up to the game and do literally nothing. You're not even inting. Like, it's not even like you're getting outplayed. You're not even trying to win the game here as Inspired on the Nidalee. It's incredibly frustrating to watch. He's going to get my dud of the game, which might not make sense when you look at the score lines. He only died once, but that should give you a pretty good indicator as to what was happening in this game. There were so many fights taken by both Evil Geniuses and G2. Kaori was certainly trying his best. JoJo was certainly trying his best. Vulcan had some really clutch saves towards the middle of this game. But they could only do so much because it was actually a 4v5 the whole game. Kind of a 3v5 because Impact was also awful in this one. He was getting absolutely destroyed top lane by Broken Blade. His lane was basically doomed from level 1 because of the Yankos gank. And from that point onwards, he was never going to survive until like level 7, level 8. And by that point, Broken Blade and the rest of G2 was so out of control, the game was just not winnable. But man, like, outside of that, like, those top two, they have to simply be better. Impact has been a weak link for Evil Geniuses all year long, most specifically in the playoffs, and that's continued here at Worlds. Both of the first two games he hasn't been good in the main group stage, and he really wasn't all that good in play-ins either. And Inspired, he was great in play-ins, but this was just bad. I don't care if you think you're running it. You have to try to make plays. You're on Nidalee, for Christ's sake. Like, he was like, oh, I guess we'll scale, and it's freaking Nidalee set Varus into a Aphelios, Fiora, Sylas, and they're down 3k gold. Like, what did you expect was going to happen this game? Just a complete and utter lack of knowledge of the matchup and of preparation and of execution. Just a bad game from Evil Geniuses. Really nothing else to say. If there was a bright spot, I thought Kaori was actually positioning really well towards the back half of these fights and was actually making them pretty interesting at the end of the day. Certainly wasn't perfect, but, sometimes getting caught out by a rampant Aphelios Q with the Gravitum can, like, shut down your entire game, and that's unfortunately just what happened to Kaori in some of these fights. He really wasn't playing all that bad, just they were too far behind at that point, and outside of the Varus, there was literally negative damage coming out from this team. The Nidalee was doing nothing. Set, Maokai, Tom Kench, not going to do anything, right? You're really relying a ton on that Varus to be able to generate a lot of that damage, and he just wasn't there. So, what does Evil Geniuses need to do? Well, I can't even begin to tell you, because I don't even hate the comp and ideology. I don't like the Nidalee pick. I think there are things that do what Nidalee does here, but a little bit better. I understand the ideology of like, oh, maybe we need some AP in the jungle and we want to go for an early game focused champion. You know, Nidalee, I'm good at it, you know, blah, blah, blah. But if you're going to do that, you simply have to push the tempo. You cannot wait for the other team to make plays and react to them like Inspire did. He was power farming on Nidalee, and he was up like a camp. And it's just, it's awful. Awful, awful, awful. It's easy to sit here and blame draft and say, like, this was unwinnable, but I truly think this draft has outs. I think the execution of this draft was literally negative. Like, I think I could have played this draft better than some of these players could, and I'm awful at this game, and so certainly some things to figure out there for Evil Geniuses. But for G2, this is great. Talk about a momentum builder. Talk about a confidence rearranger. You got absolutely blasted yesterday. You come back out on the stage and you look really good here. Caps looks good. Targamas, Yankos, Broken Blade, Flathead. Pretty much everybody on the team looked good. No real major mistakes made in this game, and that's got to feel good. You were able to get a lead. You were able to dominate the mid game and close it out without really any sort of problems. G2 or EG had one team fight where it looked like they might be in it a little bit, but even outside of that, like, G2 really had no problems in this game. They controlled the macro, they controlled the objectives, they controlled the tempo, even with the comp that was supposed to scale into the late game. So for them, you've got to be pretty happy. But unfortunately for G2, I have no idea what this actually means for them, because it really just felt like this was more Evil Geniuses losing the game and not even trying to win than it was G2, like, dominating. So we'll see. They definitely have some tougher challenges ahead of them. The game against JDG is going to be incredibly interesting, and then obviously we've got a full day of games coming up for Group B. So we'll see where G2 stands very, very shortly, but just after this game, it's actually a little bit more difficult to tell than it may be on the surface. Moving on to game number 3 now, and we jump back into Group A. We haven't seen them in a little bit, not at all today, and we kick it off with a banger here, as EU Korea always seem to have some of the most interesting matchups of any two regions playing each other in international tournaments, and this one was certainly not an exception. We saw Rogue beat up on DRX earlier, and we see another EU win here as we see the number 3 seed coming out of the LEC in Europe in Fnatic actually take down the number 2 seed coming out of the LCK in Korea in T1. Huge, absolutely huge win for Fnatic here. This actually makes Group A incredibly interesting, because T1 absolutely bodied EDG yesterday. That was the least close game of Worlds that I have watched so far. Maybe not counting play-ins, there were some pretty not short, not close ones. RNG, Isurus definitely comes to mind, but definitely the least close game of group stage so far was T1 EDG yesterday. So for Fnatic to come out here and absolutely style on T1, look like the better team for most of this game, is hugely impressive to Fnatic. They were actually able to generate a pretty decent lead in the early game, and then from there it was never able to be taken away. Owner made a really good play to be able to invade Razork. Unfortunately, he didn't realize that Razork would stick around after he basically took everything from him in his jungle. It was a great play. Owner had basically everything there, but unfortunately he ends up overextending towards the beginning here. He gets caught out by a Poppy who flashes onto him inside the brush and stuns him against the wall. You have Upset and Hylissang able to turn and burn there, and Upset ends up with 2 kills and double buffs, and basically from there on, the game is in Fnatic's hands. Upset is so strong on the Lucian at that point, which, let's point out, again, another Lucian Nami coming out of another European team. Clearly that this region doesn't think that the bot lane has been nerfed nearly enough to be taken off, and honestly, with how they've played in the 3 games that we've seen them at Worlds so far, RNG, Rogue, and Fnatic have all looked very, very good on the duo. I would expect maybe them to rise in prominence as the tournament goes on, because Lucian still does a lot of the things that Lucian was supposed to do when he was a high pick in the meta just a couple of weeks ago, and so Upset plays him really, really, really well here. Like I said, able to get that early lead, and then from that point onwards, there's really not a lot that the Aphelios can actually do in this lane. Upset and Hilly do a great job to actively pressure it and make sure that there isn't really opportunities for T1 to come down and try to make a play surrounding Lucian. Razork is pretty commonly surrounding that bot lane, making sure that Lucian can get moved forward, and honestly, Razork plays a genuinely phenomenal game here. It was very difficult for me not to give him my player of the game, and while he did play great, he did make a few mistakes here or there, and honestly, the champion Poppy, like, you can make a lot of things happen just by being Poppy. I actually gave a little bit more credit and my player of the game here to Upset on the Lucian. Like I said, he was given a ton of responsibility in this game on that Lucian. He was the hyper carry. Yes, you have Humanoid on the Azir, but he really wasn't given all that much in the early game, and while he did do well in lane against Faker, and we'll talk about that in a second, Upset was the hyper carry of this game. He was given the Nami, he was given the Poppy, and in the late game, he definitely showed up. He outdamaged everybody by a considerable margin. That, for me, is a player of the game-worthy performance. Upset has been phenomenal at this tournament so far. He was great in play-ins. Hell, he was great in playoffs. And so, Upset really kind of proving what I've been saying over the past few months to be pretty true, that he is pretty much without a doubt at this point the best AD carry in Europe. I don't really think anybody else is even on that radar, so Upset really showing up in his first international tournament. You have to remember, no MSI, no Worlds for Upset before this. Fnatic obviously made it last year, but the whole Bean situation happened there. So Upset playing at his first international event, and he's not letting it go to waste. Hylissang coming back in feels a lot more grounded, I would say, now than he did when he first came back in. In play-ins, definitely feels a lot more controlled, but it definitely feels like this team has a lot more confidence under their belt. They came out and really dominated that bot lane, and while Upset was great, Hylissang was also great too. Was willing to die for the cause a couple of times, which definitely helped Upset get a few more kills than he maybe would have gotten normally. And then, like I said, Razork was also genuinely terrific this game. All three of them super crucial to this team's run in playoffs that ended up getting them to the World Championships in the first place, and those are the three that are really going to need to step up in order for this Fnatic team to perform like this. Well, you know what I mean? At Worlds, you know, this is exactly what we wanted them to perform at. So, great performance from those three. Humanoid has been sensational throughout this tournament, and honestly, he was just better than Faker in this game. I know the Azir-Akali matchup is pretty Azir favored in the early game, especially, you know, 1-6. Unfortunately for Faker, by the time we hit that mid game, there really weren't a lot of skirmishes for that Akali to take to try and generate a snowball to get kind of out of control in this one. And that just meant that Faker really was never on the board. That Akali could never make the impact that Faker had in game number 1 against EDG in this one. And Owner was able to pick up some kills. They were trying to play around Zeus towards the back half of the game, but it just simply was never going to be enough for T1. Unfortunately, my dud of the game is going to go to Gumayusi in the bottom lane. A lot of people were talking into this tournament about whether or not Gumayusi could hold up. He obviously didn't have the same kind of summer that he had a spring. The MSI performance definitely got into his head, and that was very clear. Obviously, Joe Marsh coming out with that big report, that big, like, tell-all, like, in the Players' Tribune. If you haven't checked that one out, I highly recommend you go and check it out. Joe Marsh put out a tweet. It's pinned on his Twitter. It's pretty easy to find. I can link it in the description, but it's pretty easy to find. Just a great article about how these players really weren't performing at their best. Not only was the meta not up to their standards, but their mental was basically destroyed by all of the hate that these people constantly get over and over and over again. We've heard about the trucks and everything with T1, like it's no surprise or anything, but Guma just doesn't seem like he's fully recovered yet. He was a lot better in summer than I think a lot of people gave him credit for. He wasn't great, but he certainly wasn't a disaster for this T1 team by any stretch of the imagination, and I was kind of hoping that that's what he would be for T1 going into this tournament, because Zeus, Owner, Faker, Keria, like, those players are good enough where if, like, Guma is just, like, an okay AD carry, they could be a top 3-ish team at the tournament, but unfortunately, Guma was not good in this game. A little bit of a difficult scenario for him, obviously, with Upset kind of playing super aggressive in the early game, getting those double buffs, really being able to generate and snowball that lead. There really wasn't a ton Guma could do, but his positioning in the back half of these team fights was really not good. It was really easy for him to get caught. There were multiple moments where he was getting dove. Overall, just not a good performance from Guma, and he's going to have to step up. He's going to have to be better than this if T1 does want to be a top 4-ish team in the world, like I think they can be. But you could say the same thing about Faker. He got beat by Humanoid in lane. There's really nothing else to say. Obviously, the lane matchup isn't super Akali favored, but you still kind of got to win that, and unfortunately, he wasn't able to. He wasn't able to snowball quite like he was in game 1. Owner certainly tried to make plays, like I said, invaded Razork, ended up causing first blood and really setting the Lucian on a spiral out of control, but it was a good play up until that point. He was making smart decisions until he just overextended. I don't think he made like an awful play outside of that in this game. He was honestly keeping T1 in the game for a considerable amount of the mid game, really trying to play through that Jax in the top lane who was winning. Wonder wasn't really doing all that much, and not that you have to on the Aatrox and the Jax, but just, you know, Zeus was kind of their win con, I think, towards the back half of this game. Unfortunately, it was just never going to be enough. With Faker, Guma basically out of the game and Upset so far ahead, there really wasn't a ton that those players were actually going to be able to do to win the game for T1. But what does this mean? Well, it makes Group A really interesting, and I'll talk about that in a second, but what does it mean for T1 in particular? A little bit of whiplash here, going from probably the most dominant win of group stage so far against EDG to a loss against a team that you probably have no business losing to. Play and buff absolutely is real, but I trust T1. This draft maybe isn't the best. You don't really have a ton of tools to be able to get out into the early game, especially against something like a Lucian Nami. You really have no way to punish that lane if the Viego's not getting the ball rolling. Maybe an early game jungler would fix a lot of the issues I have with this team, or potentially just a more scaling, you know, control mage oriented mid lane, or something like the Victor, I think could be a little bit more positive, I would say, for T1 here. Outside of that, you just got to play the early game better. It was the play that really messed up your game, not so much the ideology around it. As long as Owner can kind of keep it in the bag and keep that bot lane from getting too far out of control, I think T1 would tend to win this game most of the time. Unfortunately, this was not most of the time. For Fnatic, this is great. You knew your win condition and you played exactly to it. Razork makes that phenomenal play to secure the first blood, and from that point onwards, it's Fnatic's game to lose, and they play it out perfectly. This is the Fnatic we saw in playoffs. This is the Fnatic everybody wanted to see going into the season. This is the Fnatic that I could barely get myself to not put #1 in the power rankings, even when they were sitting out of the playoffs in the LEC regular season. I always knew that this was a team that was going to turn it on. Obviously, Humanoid, in previous interviews, things like Euphoria, he's always talked about how the regular season's a little bit of a grind for him, and he really turns it on for the big moments. Well, that's what we're seeing here. Humanoid can still be one of the best mid laners that the West has, if not one of the best mid laners in the world, and I think he's shown that relatively consistently. If Razork can play like he did in playoffs and like he did in this game, Upset and Hylissang are gonna get ahead, and they're very, very, very difficult to stop. This Fnatic team is dangerously good, and a team that could very, very well make their way out of this group now with this win, because you're setting up a situation where you're now sitting at 2-0. You really only have to win like one more game to at least be in a decent position to make it out, but if you can pick up another win against C9 and potentially a win against, you know, one in the games against EDG or another win against T1, you're pretty much guaranteeing your way out of this group at 4-2. And so you've got to feel incredibly good for Fnatic. They've set themselves up perfectly. You just have to hope that they can hold on to this as they go through the rest of this group stage. Moving on to game number 4 now, and game number 4, definitely an interesting one as well. We're sticking with Group A here. We just saw the two teams that went 1-0 yesterday face off against each other. It's time to check out the teams that went 0-1 yesterday take on each other here, as we have the number 3 seed out of the LPL in China in EDG Edward Gaming, taking on the number 1 seed out of the LCS in North America in Cloud9. And unfortunately for NA fans, it's another NA loss here as EDG picks up pretty clean win. This isn't really a surprise to a lot of people. EDG were seen as pretty big favorites in this matchup and in this group in general. Obviously, I had T1 over them, and so the loss yesterday wasn't too shocking, but I think a lot of people had EDG as one of the best teams at this tournament, and so for them to be able to pick up a win over Cloud9, not really all that surprising. Unfortunately, the way it was done wasn't all that promising for NA fans. We were probably hoping for something a little bit more competitive, maybe at least keeping up in terms of pressure, but no. Just kind of a dominant win for EDG. It happens. It is what it is. EDG actually go for a pretty interesting comp. This is something akin to what you would have seen a lot in summer, in my opinion, out of this team. A bot lane focused hyper carry, something like the Jinx, scout with the Azir in the mid lane, but not your typical Azir. If you follow any amount of the LPL, you'll know that a lot of the Azir players in the LPL, unlike the LCK, unlike the LCS, things like that, where they typically go Leandries and go for that damage build, you're going to see a lot of Azir players in the LPL go Crown. And that's mostly because a lot of them like to do the more engaged style Azir players. They're not sitting on the backline trying to output a bunch of DPS damage. They're really going in, trying to use that ultimate as a playmaking tool to set up their Aatrox, to set up their Jinx in this case as the hyper carry in the bottom lane. That's really what EDG and what a lot of Azirs in the LPL tend to do, and he executed that flawlessly here. You add on to that the Poppy, which we just saw can be super effective if used correctly. Obviously, that W is still incredibly useful. Even if her jungle clear is a little bit slower now, you still can, you know, be super useful in the late game. And then the creme de la creme of this game was the Thresh in the support position. Now, this is a pick that we're not really seeing all that much. Of course, Thresh kind of fell out of the meta throughout most of this year because of the nerfs that he had been received over and over and over again. They kind of nerfed him into the ground, but they started giving him some consolation buffs, and he's slowly kind of getting his way back in here. We've seen him almost exclusively as a partner to Aphelios up until this point, but Cloud9 blind picks their Aphelios R2, leaves up their support pick for the last one, and so EDG just says, we're going to take away the Thresh. We're not going to give you the option to play that Aphelios Thresh bottom lane. Not that I don't think, I think Cloud9 probably would have picked it if they wanted to play it. It seemed like they were fine not playing it, but man, the big problem was giving Thresh to Mako, because as we all know, Mako's pretty good at that champion, and boy, did he show that off in this game. It is very, very rare that we see such a stylish performance from a support, especially this year with the meta that we've had, with it being Yuumi and Lulu and all these things that aren't really something that you can be super proactive and stylish on. To see a Thresh come out and make predict hooks and just be super cool and game-changing, like, that's what I want to see. I want to see more Thresh in the meta. Mako's going to get my player of the game. Anybody who watched that is not surprised at all by that decision. Mako was genuinely phenomenal here, and I really do think he was the biggest reason that EDG was able to win this. Those team fights were essentially unwinnable for Cloud9, not only because Viper was winning the lane, which can happen here. I do think that Aphelios and Jinx go relatively even depending on who the better player is, but as we all know, Viper is the better player. He's the number 2 ADC in the world for me. I think you could reportedly put him even higher. Obviously, I like Ruler a lot, but Viper being number 2, certainly not a complaint from me at all. And when you have that situation, you have Mako on this Thresh who just simply cannot miss a hook if he tried. It creates a lot of problems. I'll add along with that the fact that you've got a ton of people just basically power ganking mid lane over and over and over again. You've got Scout, of course, being able to set up a lot of these plays once he hits 6 with that engage ultimate. You've got JJ really hovering around that mid lane a ton, making sure the Azir is often in a position to be able to be backed up if anything were to happen in the mid lane. And then the amount of times that Flandre left lane in this game was absolutely absurd. Huge credit to Flandre. Obviously, longtime LPL fans will know him as someone who is not afraid to sacrifice. We saw that at Worlds last year. A lot of moving into the jungle to make sure that JJ was able to generate a lead. That was a big part why they were so successful against DAMWON in the finals last year, but Flandre's game plan really hasn't changed all that much. He was against the Fiora here. Fudge gets another counter pick. They first pick the Aatrox. Fudge goes with the Fiora again as a counter pick today instead of as a blind, and doesn't work out again today, but we'll get to that. Flandre is just content being able to let Fudge freeze the wave and for him to just leave, go make a play mid lane, come back, and still be up in CS because Fudge really had absolutely no pressure in that top lane to be able to create basically anything. Honestly, everything that could go right for EDG this game went right. You got down to these back half of the team fights. Obviously, Blabber was able to make some plays here and there, but nothing that was concrete at all. Fudge was certainly able to get in on some team fights, but his laning phase was so disastrous that honestly, by like 10 minutes, this game felt over. Like, it felt unwinnable for Cloud9. We had that giant pause. We had the chrono break that we had to get into the bottom lane, and during all that, like, it was at like 8, 9, 10 minutes, something like that, and the game already felt completely over. We were already talking as if NA was going to not win another game here today, and so that's really where it's at now for Cloud9. While EDG, I should say, played really well in this game, and you got to give him a lot of credit. Mako was phenomenal again on that Thresh. I can't stress enough. If you can find that clip of Thresh hitting that predict hook from this game, I highly recommend you do so. Obviously, the whole game probably isn't worth a watch, but that clip certainly is if you can find it. EDG was great, but Cloud9 was really bad. Like, in the previous game, I was talking about Fnatic versus T1 being really Fnatic favored, and how it wasn't necessarily T1 playing genuinely awful. They made one mistake in the early game, and then Fnatic kind of ran away with it. In this one, it was Cloud9 just having zero pressure on the map. I don't hate this draft in concept. Getting Aphelios Tahm Kench I don't think is all that bad. Yes, it's very safe and not super proactive in the early game, but you're going into Jinx, and Aphelios is going to hit that power spike. He's going to be able to farm up relatively easily here. The Poppy doesn't have a really good gank angle, especially post 6 on the Aphelios Thresh, and so there's not really a lot that you can actively do. Jensen's on a control mage where he can play to scale into the late game. Blabber's on something he can create plays on in the early game. Fiora is a generally good pick into Aatrox. Obviously, Fudge has not been so good on it either in playoffs or at this tournament, and so definitely a little bit of a worry there, but it's not really the draft that I'm sitting here super worried about. It's the fact that they get so far behind so early in the game. So many plays made by EDG in the mid lane to be able to accelerate Scout and accelerate JJ, and even Flandre was getting accelerated just from these plays in the mid lane. Blabber does trade back on a couple of these, but there's really not a lot that Cloud9 does to even try to neutralize. It seems like they're late to basically everything in this game, and I think that's pretty indicative of Cloud9 as a whole. They're on the back foot, not on the front foot. This is not what you wanted to see out of a team coming out of, not one of the power regions. I'm willing to call NA not one of the power regions right now. Unfortunately, EU might sneak their way back into that category. I wouldn't have thought so before the tournament, but EU definitely showing up well today. This isn't about them, it's about Cloud9. When you're not one of these teams that can mechanically go head-to-head with EDG, you need to be able to play aggressive early in the game so that you can generate a game state where you can play from ahead. Because if you're playing from even or if you're playing from behind, it's simply doomed. Even for a team like Cloud9 that is very mechanically talented, I would say, for NA players. I think Blabber, I think Berserker are both phenomenal mechanical players. You're just not going to be able to react because their macro's better than yours and their mechanics are better than yours. So you have to be able to generate that lead early. Unfortunately, Blabber made essentially 0 plays early in the game. Even though he played kind of well towards the mid game and was trying to create a lot of situations for Cloud9, there really was just not a lot you could do. Jensen was awful this game, completely taken out. The Victor with low mobility was a super easy target. He had to blow his sums basically on cooldown in this game, and for that, he's going to get my dud of the game. Yes, it's not really his fault that he got turbo ganked, but also got to play safer. Like, he was often in a position where he could be caught out in the mid lane, even with, protection. He was never really in a position to be able to trade back either. Definitely something that Victor needs to be able to do, and by the time he was getting dove under his tier 2, it was too far. Like, he had been ganked 3 times and died to all of them already. He just needs to have more wherewithal. He continues to be the worst mid in this group, maybe the worst mid at the tournament right now, and that's just never going to be a good look for Cloud9 as a whole. So he's my dud of the game. I think you could realistically give it to Fudge as well, though. Another bad game from Fudge. really not a lot to say outside of that. He has to be better. He gets counterpick on the Fiora here and looks just as bad as he did in game 1 with counterpick on the Fiora. If he can't play the champion, don't play the champion. Why is he freezing the wave when Flandre is going mid over and over and over again? Why is he not shoving into tower? Flandre lost almost nothing for those moves because he came back and the wave state was exactly where he wanted it to be. Absolutely awful decision-making from Fudge and from Cloud9 as a whole. The macro was just not good, so... What does Cloud9 need to change? Well, they just simply have to play more aggro. It seems like they're scared. They're very, very, very scared right now. And playing scared at an international tournament, like, that's what loses you games. That's what we always associated with TSM back in the day, with TL when they had the super team roster of... They went to Worlds and they played not to lose instead of playing to win. That's what Cloud9's doing right now. They're playing not to lose, not playing to win. They have to start making plays in the early game. They have to start setting the tempo. If they just let the game move by, they're not going to be winning games against teams like EDG, against teams like T1, or against teams like Fnatic. And so I really need to see a momentum and a mentality change from this team in order to have any sort of confidence that they're even going to be able to take a game at this tournament in a really, really stacked Group A. As for EDG, this is about as good as it can get as a rebound. Obviously, we're talking about that a bit with G2 earlier. Very similar things with EDG. EDG, kind of hard to say fast. I haven't had trouble with that all year, but I guess I'm having trouble with it now. Not a bad game. Mako was phenomenal here, and you were really able to generate a lot of leads through that mid lane. Not a lot of teams are going to give you this opportunity a lot of the time, and so it's definitely going to be interesting to see them match up against a team like Fnatic. Very, very intrigued with that, but for now, all you can really say about EDG is that they looked good in this game, and there's reason to believe that they can continue that, especially if Viper, Scout, JJ all really step up. And if Mako can get Thresh and play like this again, games are going to be easy for them no matter who they're playing in this tournament. Jumping into game number 5 now. We get down to the final 2 here, and the final 2 are definitely some of the more interesting ones for diametrically opposed reasons. The first one here in game number 5, definitely interesting because it's 2 teams we have yet to see on the world stage. No play-in teams, no nothing. Just 2 Group C teams that did not get to play in day 1. And suffice it to say, I think a lot of people were excited to see both of them for different reasons. So let's get into it. It's going to be the number 2 seed from the LPL in China in Top Esports, taking on the number 1 seed from the VCS in Vietnam in GAM Esports. And unfortunately for all the GAM fans out there, me included, love this team. Top Esports is a little bit out of their pay grade, and I think we knew that going into it just a tad bit, but still interesting to watch. They try some stuff early on in the game that I think was a little aggressive. Levy actually does a really good job in the early game of actually putting T on a little bit off counter. That Poppy clear is actually very exploitable, and I actually thought Levy did a really good job of being able to catch him once he got to that bot side of the clear, and that's good. Those are the kinds of positive thinking things that I want teams that are underdogs to do, right? I want you to try and be able to take advantage of when teams aren't optimal, right? Like when you pick the Poppy for the late game, try and take advantage of that early game, right? Like there are things there that you can punish. The problem with that is that very, very quickly turns into a stalled game, which turns into an 8-minute quadra kill in their own jungle. Or I should say 4 for 0, not a quadra kill. A double kill for both Knight and Jackie Love. My bad. And from there on out, the game is completely and utterly over. There is nothing you can do, and that sucks. I don't hate the comp in theory on the side of GAM. Obviously, a lot of the signature stuff getting taken out here, the Nocturne, the Rise, things that they've gone to pretty consistently over the course of the year, not going to be let through, so they have to go for the Sejuani. They go for the more confrontational top lane here in the Jax, and then the Syndra in the mid lane. Something that Knight obviously does play. We've seen Xiaohu pull it out in the play-ins. It's not completely out of left field to see this at the World Championships, but Katie's just not the kind of player that's going to be able to play up against Knight's Ahri with the Syndra. You got to be super proactive. You have to be incredibly lane dominant, and Katie's just not that player. Like, I saw Katie as a little bit of a weakness for GAM going into this event, and not to say, like, he was bad in this game by any stretch, but just only so much you can do. Like, if he's not going to be a dominant player, if he's not able to keep up with Knight, this matchup is relatively difficult, and so that's kind of what ended up happening for Top Esports. What did they do well? Well, I do like their comp. I do think it actually gives them a lot of agency. The Poppy is something that we're continuing to see rise back into popularity. If teams feel comfortable playing it, then they should play it. The clear is obviously heavily nerfed, and you're not going to be nearly as quick in the early game, but everything that Poppy does in the late game, still applicable. Like, it's still very, very good, as we've seen throughout the day. Obviously, the gank support, very, very heavy, can really set up lanes well, especially when you have a ton of other CC coming out in the lanes here with the Ahri charm, with the Yuumi, a lot of other things that can help set up that Poppy a little bit easier, and so Tion pulls that out here. While he is punished, like I said, a tad bit for the early clear, it really doesn't amount to anything, and by the time that, like, they're able to actually catch back up, TES is in a position where they're just way too far ahead. You have the Gnar in the top lane. We're not even going to talk about Wayward in this one. I'm just going to spoiler alert you guys. He was involved in, like, nothing in this game. I honestly forgot that there was a top lane for, like, 90% of this game, and so I'm not even really going to talk about Wayward, but he was there on the Gnar. You've got Knight on the Ahri. This is a pick that I'm really shocked has basically completely fallen out of the meta. Like, where did Ahri go? She does exactly what she did in playoffs. She takes over a lot of the proactivity plays. Like, she can shove really well. The charm is always useful. She has immense amount of mobility and can't really be caught out. I don't really see what exactly you don't like about Ahri right now. Her damage isn't, like, exceptional, but it's still pretty good, and people are picking LeBlanc, and I think she has similar levels of damage to LeBlanc. Maybe not as consistent, but I would say relatively similar. So Knight pulls her out here, does super well on it, gets those kills in the early game, and then is able to transition, is really never in danger at any point, and is really, really consistent. It's Knight. It's, in my opinion, the best player in the world on a champion that can just not be caught if she doesn't want to. And then you add on to that, like, the Sivir Yuumi in the bottom lane, and you're like, okay, so they just don't want to adapt from playoffs, but you know what? Sivir Yuumi's still really, really good. Like, a lot of these things, like, this is a playoff, this is a 12-15 patch comp from Top Esports, but Ahri didn't get nerfed. Sivir got nerfed, but only a little bit. Yuumi got buffed, in a sense. Her damage is way higher. And let me tell you, did Mark take advantage of that? If there's ever if there's ever a time to see Yuumi in pro play, this is the build I want to see from Yuumi in pro play. Everfrost, Magi's, yes, please. That is unbelievable, and it's unpunishable. Like, that's that's the thing that makes me so mad, is that is so completely unpunishable and undealable with. This Yuumi was able to take over laning phase so consistently, so easily. It was able to set up kills in the bot lane so efficiently, and then even in the top lane, when you started getting the Sejuani roaming up top with the Yuumi on top, ganking that Jax relatively repeatedly, just some good plays for Mark to hop off, get those stuns out with the ultimate. Obviously, the ult CD has now been lowered, and the damage is higher, and so, honestly, the gank assist is even heavier now if you want to go mid laner, if you want to go top laner, whatever you want to do here for the Yuumi. Really, the only thing she's worse at is these extended trades in lane, but even then, she might honestly be a little bit better because her poke is just so significantly higher. The damage on her Q is way more, and like I said, the ult cooldown is something not to be trifled with, and so builds like Everfrost Magi's are now viable. We've seen a ton of Yuumis build Ludens super consistently at this tournament. That's just what she's turned into. She's turned into a poke mage. She is Zyra. She is, you know, Brand. Like, that's what she does now, and Mark played it excellently. I mean, the Yuumi was able to completely take over this game. He's going to get player of the game for Top Esports here. I hate giving player of the game to Yuumi players, but, I mean, sometimes Yuumi is just by far the most impactful champion in the game. And unfortunately, that's what we got here for Top Esports. Still great. Jackie Love was on fire. He was doing a bajillion damage by, like, 3 minutes. Like I said, 8 minutes in the game, he gets a double kill, and from that point onwards, unstoppable. The ricochets, actually, with crits, were doing, like, 400 per, and it was to everyone on the team. His damage by the end of this game, actually disgusting. Speaking of damage, obviously, you have to talk about the Yuumi as well. You have to talk about Mark and the Yuumi as well here, because he outdamaged everybody on GAM, and then the Sivir did 80% of GAM's entire damage, like, as a team. And so, yeah, that's where we're at. Like, Top dominated this game. It was over in 24 minutes. It wasn't close. Knight was untouchable. Jackie Love was untouchable. Mark was phenomenal. Tion had a little bit of a rough early game, but ended up bouncing back, in Wayward, no offense, just didn't do anything. He didn't need to do anything. It was fine. For GAM, on the other end, a little bit frustrating. Your first game at Worlds in many, many years, when you should have been here the past couple of years. This is a team that has not finished worse than second in 4 years. So yeah, they've certainly been in a position to make the World Championships. Unfortunately, obviously, everything going on with the VCS, with the visas, over the past few years, the region has not been able to be represented at the World Championships, but they finally get their shot here, and their first game's against Top Esports. Tough draw, but other games in this group might be relatively winnable. It's hard to know what exactly this team is right now, because they were really good in the VCS, and they looked really dominant, and we kind of saw what a team like Saigon Buffalo could do in the play-ins. They weren't able to take out Mad Lions, but they certainly put up a fight, and they weren't like a pushover team, and you're hoping GAM is just like a better version of that. I had high hopes for Levy, and I really had high hopes for Style and BA going into this tournament, because I thought they were really, really good in playoffs, and Levy does some interesting things in the early game, but he's on the Sejuani, not much he can do. Unfortunately for Style and BA, that 4 for 0 early on in the game was basically the death sentence for them. BA tries to go in on this Rel multiple times throughout the game. Not really much you can do as Rel from behind, and unfortunately that's just what happens. He goes in to try and get those stuns to try to set up the Tristana, try to set up the Jax, even the Syndra to an extent, and he just dies, like, instantly. The CC doesn't even really get off, and so there's really not a lot you can do. The Everfrost making that even harder. Screw this Yuumi, absolutely despicable. Double Everfrost, by the way, with Knight and Mark. So you gotta love that for the side of Top Esports, but it was just a skill gap. It was an everything gap, and it's hard to blame GAM. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to sit here and blame them, because Top Esports, very likely a top 3, top 2 team in the world right now, and for that, like, do you think a team from the VCS can play against the top 2 team in the world? They shouldn't be able to. They don't have the resources, the infrastructure to be able to keep up with that. So this was always going to be their toughest matchup. Unfortunately, it just kind of came out in their first game at Worlds. It's really hard to talk about it, so I don't really have a lot to say. They just got run over early and they couldn't come back. Not a lot of analysis in that section. BA is going to get my dud of the game, like I said, trying to engage on the rel. Not going to happen when you get blown up basically immediately, but Style didn't play well. Levy was certainly getting blown up towards the back half of these games. Kia did nothing and was getting caught out in the top lane, but whatever. I mean, you could give it to the entire GAM team. The entire GAM team is done of the game, if we're being honest. They just got outplayed. They got outskilled. They were not on the same level, and that's okay. They were never supposed to be, so what do I think for GAM going forward? Well, I think their real first game at Worlds is going to be tomorrow. Obviously, going against Top Esports, not a great start to the group for you. You're going to be able to bounce back. Hopefully, you're going to be able to put up a better fight against Rogue and DRX, some of the easier teams in this group. Top Esports just seems to be a team that is a little bit unreachable for them, but they're clearly not afraid to play their own style, pulling out the Syndra, pulling out the Trist, you know, the Nocturne pulling out the first ban, and the Ryze getting banned as well. Clearly, they have a playstyle that they want to go to. We'll see if other teams allow that to open up a bit more, but it was just never going to happen in this one. For Top, again, hard to tell how good they are. They absolutely demolished GAM. I don't actually think GAM is all that bad of a team, but Top definitely way out of their pay grade. It's going to be a lot more interesting to see them go up against a team like Rogue or a team like DRX to see if they can maintain this level of dominance. If they walk out of this group 6-0, having absolutely stomped everybody, I could very, very, very quickly change my prediction on who's going to win the World Championships. But there are so many good teams playing in groups right now, and we always thought of Group C as maybe the group of life because there was really only Top Esports, and then the other 3 were potentially a little bit weaker. And so for Top, great win here, but not all that surprising. You just got to keep it up and hopefully get to the quarterfinals without really any sort of headache. Now moving on to our 6th and final game here of day number 2 in the group stage of Worlds 2022. And it was a good one. Everybody knew it was going to be on paper going into this tournament. And as games like that tend to do, they definitely performed. These two teams definitely stepped up to the plate and made this a very fun one to watch. Before you see the result, I know a lot of you in the comment section have been kind of letting me know to let you know when I think a lot of these games are worth going back and watching. I highly recommend that you go and watch this game. Probably the most interesting game of Worlds so far. Maybe RNG DRX is up there as well, but this was a lot of fun to watch. It's the final game of day 2 here, and it's a matchup between the number 3 seed from the LCK in Korea in DAMWON KIA and the number 1 seed from the LPL in China in JD Gaming. And JDG are able to pull away a pretty incredible victory here. A super fun game, an incredibly close game. I think I tweeted out, I can't remember a League of Legends game being this close in a very long time for as long as it was. I think they were even in gold all the way up to like 30 minutes into the game. It was actually absurd how blow for blow both of these teams were going, and it's just a credit to how good both of these two teams are. Definitely some good and bad in both of their drafts, in my opinion. I think I like JD Gaming's a little bit more, but you are kind of lacking a little bit of early initiative. You have the Graves and Azir combo that I think has very much worked out for a lot of these better teams at the tournament so far. We saw JDG pull it out yesterday against G2, and it super worked for them, but they go back to it here with the Kai'Sa in the bottom lane, the Ornn in the top lane. Not really a lot of places for you to invest super heavily in, but ideally if you hit that late game, it's going to be super valuable. Then on the side of DAMWON, a little bit of the opposite. You have a lot of tools to be able to make plays in the early to mid game, but you're not really sitting there going like, this person's going to carry the game. I always get a little bit worried when you have Varus as your bot laner because yes, he is incredibly high damage, or he's good damage, I should say, but he's not hyper carry damage, right? I don't think he can be your primary source of damage in late game teamfights for you to expect to win in the current metagame. Especially going into a comp that has Graves, Azir, or Kai'Sa, I would say all three of them are typically going to outdamage your Varus. And when he's your number one damage dealer in late game teamfights, that's where I get concerned. Where on the side of JDG, I would get concerned if the Taliyah and the Maokai form a ridiculously difficult to deal with duo in the early 10 to 15 minute part of this game, and you really have no map pressure going into the mid game. Fortunately for both teams, neither of their problems were really that accentuated here, and I think that's just because both teams went into this game with the exact idea of how to hide their weaknesses and how to accentuate their strengths. Like I said, incredibly even game all the way up until about 30 minutes in when JDG finally decisively wins a team fight. I mean, look at the stats even, not only the kills, but these teams are splitting dragons, they're splitting barons, like everything is going back and forth. In fact, DAMWON was in a really good position. I believe they were up 3 dragons to 1, and while they were down in a little bit of gold, they were really in like a good map position. Unfortunately, big fight around Dragon that leads to JDG kind of recovering that lead back. It was still relatively even, but then another big win for JDG around Baron that essentially seals the game here, and huge win from them. This is the hardest game either of these two are going to play in group stage by a considerable amount. Maybe the rematch, but certainly up until this point, this is the hardest game either of them will play in Group B. These two were the reason a lot of people saw this group as Group of Death, along with G2 being in here as the 3rd seed. It felt very disastrous for pretty much whoever was going to end up not making it, and it definitely feels like that as well. G2 with the dominant win today, but JDG and DAMWON are phenomenal. Both of them looked great the day before. I would say DAMWON looked better, but JDG, great bounce back here. Gotta talk about Yagao. Yagao played this one actually spectacularly on the Azir. Those Shuriman shuffles, I talk about it. LPL mids are just built different on this champion. You could talk about LCK Azirs, and I completely agree with you. I mean, Faker's Azir is great. We know Chovy's Azir is great. BDD is not even at this tournament. Obviously, everyone knows about his Azir. Like, we know about Korean Azirs. They can do a ridiculous amount of damage from the backline. They're basically a primary carry. They're a second AD carry, hyper carry in that mid lane. What we, I think, gloss over is LPL Azirs, who, like I talked about in the previous game, just play absolutely nuts. They go in for these spectacular engages with the Shuriman Shuffle, try to set the rest of their team up to do a ton of damage, and boy is Yagao proficient at setting his team up. Yagao had the best year of his career, pretty much no doubt, over the course of this year, getting his team to that #1 seed. He finished #2, or actually he finished #3 in my MVP voting in the LPL this year. That's how good he was, and he really showed up again here in this game on the Azir, setting up Kanavi to really make a lot of plays. And I mean, Hope, I'll give him credit in a bit, but he was gift-wrapped a lot of those early kills in the game. He did a lot with that gold that he ended up getting gift-wrapped, but Hope was playing kind of okay, and Yagao was really setting up a lot of these plays, able to get that Kai'Sa online, and then Hope was really able to take off from there. You gotta give Hope credit for the Great Escape. I mean, one of the most interesting plays of all time. They feel like they have the Kai'Sa caught out. She's behind enemy lines, but she gets out with the Hex Gate. An absolutely phenomenal play. You could hear the crowd pop off. One of those just like cool moments that you're going to remember from Worlds and from the group stage, and so really happy to see that. He played well outside of that too. Kai'Sa is growing on me as a bottom lane. I understand the idea behind it. You need setup so that Kai'Sa can go in and get her all of her damage off, but, you know, I don't know. I want something that's going to be a little bit more aggressive, potentially, with the Kai'Sa, although the Rel does really well. Pun, or I guess rhyme, not intended. You guys know what I mean. Rel does really well into Varus, and because he's super immobile, if she can get on top of him, there's really not a lot you can do to peel her off, and so that can set Kai'Sa up really well in the laning phase, and then obviously Rel is just a good thing to have in the late game because it's a free engage. Like, it is just free engage, and that's never a bad thing. Add on to top of that, like the Yagao engage, and Hope doing a ton of damage on the backline. Even the Ornhorn, if you want to bring him in for a lot of these fights, is awesome. Kanavi, well, I sing his praises a lot, and while he did do a lot of damage in this game, especially towards the back half of these team fights, and I'll talk about this with Canyon as well, the junglers were a little bit dicey in this game, I think is the word I'm looking for, as they were caught out multiple times. Certainly definite opportunities in this game that were taken advantage of by the other team. Canyon was caught out multiple times on this Maokai. Obviously going in and dying in some of these team fights is probably going to inflate his death total a bit, but there were probably 2 or 3 of these where he just simply did not need to die, and I think you could say the same for pretty much every single one of Kanavi's deaths. You just want to see more consistency out of these two junglers. They wanted to try and break that score ahead, but in a game as tense as this, you really don't want to be making mistakes, and it really felt like Kanavi and Canyon were kind of doing that. 369 on the Ornn was fine, but really this game was about Yagao setting everything up for Hope to be able to kind of slam dunk it towards the end of these fights, and man, did it really work out, and they were able to walk their way to a victory. For DAMWON, it's gotta feel awful that you aren't able to pull out a win in this one. You played really well for 30 minutes, getting objectives, trading map pressure for those objectives, and having substantial amount of things to play in the late game, but like I said, your comp was just never designed to be going into these 5v5s against JDG in that same way, especially because you draft that Renekton in the top lane. I haven't really talked about it yet, but a lot of people are going to hate this pick, and honestly, it turned out to be a complete disaster. You get to this late game, and I don't think Renekton did anything this game. He was completely invisible and a complete non-factor. If you're getting anything out of that top lane, like if you have an Aatrox, obviously he was banned, I know, but if you're getting like, I don't know, anything else, like a similar thing out of that top lane, you probably win this game. Like, it was that big of a difference. So much so that Nuguri is actually going to get my dud of the game here. It's not entirely his fault. It's not like he played awful, but he would pop ultimate, run in, get his thing off, and then just have to run out because he has no health. And he's really not doing anything, right? And that's a huge problem because you're playing a lot of these fights at a 4v5 disadvantage. Even with that, Canyon was doing a really good job to set up with those ultimates. It's incredibly difficult to go into objectives against a Maokai, as we know, especially with Talia Wall to set up things, and Dectum was doing a surprising amount of damage in the back half of the game. Varus does hurt. I just don't think he's going to hurt nearly to the same level that something like a Kai'Sa will in the late game, and so these team fights are going to be much, much more difficult. But credit to DK in this case, because they really did play out this game very, very well, and maybe with a more late game oriented comp, they actually take the win in this one, full stop. But very, 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 very fun to watch. Where do these two teams go? Well, DAMWON and JDG both get easier games from now on out, obviously, until we get to wrapping it back around against each other. But these are the two teams that should be fighting to get out of the group. DAMWON dominating yesterday against G2, JDG pulling out a win against EG, but EG doesn't really look like they're going to be contenders. It's going to be interesting to see JDG versus EG, or versus G2. Sorry, now I'm getting all the tricodes mixed up, but it's going to be interesting to see JDG versus G2, because it'll be interesting to see if JDG plays down to their opponent like they could it sometimes during the regular season. Definitely historically, JDG has done that, but I'm really not super concerned about both of these teams. I think these two teams are two of the best at the entire tournament, potentially two of the top four. I think they've proven that relatively consistently, and I just hope we get another banger out of these two when they play against each other again later on in the group stage. All right, well, that is going to do it for my Day 2 Worlds 2022 group stage overview and analysis. A lot of really, really fun games today that I was really excited to talk about. Let me know how you felt about all of these games, of course, down in the comment section below. What was your favorite game of the day? What was your least favorite game of the day? Who was your player of the day? Who is impressing you? Who is not? You know all that jazz. Leave it down in the comment section below. And of course, while you're down there, I'm going to shill just a tad bit. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you made it all the way to the end of this hour-long video, I promise that you're going to enjoy a lot of the other content that I'm putting out on this channel. It's very similar, very analysis-oriented, review-oriented. Of course, I do predictions as well. If you want to know what I thought of these teams going into the tournament, of course, you can check out a lot of my pre-Worlds content up on this channel. I have a whole playlist for it. I'm going to put it up in the top right now. You can go and check that out if you are interested. And of course, if you did enjoy the video, I really, it really would mean a lot to me if you could hit the like button. It helps get this out to a lot more people. Obviously, I put a ton of time and effort not only into recording these videos and watching these games, but making the graphics and editing and all that kind of stuff. So just to kind of support the channel, it would really mean a lot to me if you guys would hit that like button. You guys have been great about that at Worlds so far. A lot of you are really consistent with that, and I'm very thankful. And honestly, I'm just really happy to see that you guys are enjoying the content overall. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.